Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to start Little Blue Book number... Oh, it doesn't have a number. Oh, yeah, there it is. 277. This is one of the rare ones that has the number up there in little type instead of big. All right, Little Blue Book number 277, The Man Without a Country. And I had to look this up. This is a true story. So, move that back a little bit. Alrighty, here we go. There is no copyright date in this one. This is written by Edward Everett Hale. Okay, The Man Without a Country. I suppose that very few casual readers of the New York Herald of August 13th observed in an obscure corner among the deaths the announcement. Nolan died on board U.S. corvette Levant, latitude 2 degrees 11 south, longitude 131 degrees west, on the 11th of May. Phillip Nolan. I happened to observe it because I was stranded at the old mission house in Mackinac, waiting for a Lake Superior steamer which did not choose to come. And I was devouring to the very stubble all the current literature I could get a hold of, even down to the deaths and marriages in the Herald. My memory for names and people is good, and the reader will see, as he goes on, that I had reason enough to remember Phillip Nolan. There are hundreds of readers who will have paused at that announcement. If the officer of the Levant who reported it had chosen to make it thus: died May 11th, the man without a country. For it was as the man without a country that poor Phillip Nolan had generally been known by the officers who had him in charge during some 50 years, as indeed by all the men who sailed under them. I dare say there is many a man who has taken wine with him once a fortnight in a 3 years' cruise, who never knew that his name was Nolan, or whether he had any name at all. There can now be no possible harm in telling his story. Reason enough there has been till now, ever since Madison's administration went out in 1817 for very strict secrecy. The secrecy of honor itself among the gentlemen of the Navy who have had Nolan in successive charge. According, and certainly it speaks well for the esprit de corps of the profession and the personal honor of its members, that to the press this man's story has been wholly unknown. And I think to the country at large also. I have reason to think, for some investigations I made in the Naval Archives when I was attached to the Bureau of Construction, that every official report relating to him was burned when Ross burned the public buildings at Washington. One of the Tuckers, or possibly one of the Watsons, had Nolan in charge at the end of the war, and when, on returning from his cruise, he reported at Washington to one of the Crowninshields, who was in the Navy Department when he came home. He found that the department ignored the whole business, whether they really knew nothing about it, or whether it was a non me recordio, determined on as a piece of policy. I do not know. But this I do know, that since 1817, and possibly before, no naval officer has mentioned Nolan in his report of a cruise. But, as I say, there is no need for secrecy any longer. And now he is dead. It seems to me worthwhile to tell a little of his story, by way of showing young Americans of today what it is to be a man without a country. Phillip Nolan was a fine young officer, and as there was in the Legion of the West, as the Western Division of our army was then called, when Aaron Burr made his first dashing expedition down to New Orleans in 1805. At Fort Massac, or somewhere above on the river, he met, as the devil would have it, this gay, dashing, bright young fellow at some dinner party, I think. Burr marked him, talked to him, walked with him, took him a day or two's voyage in his flatboat, and, in short, fascinated him. For the next year, barrack life was very tame for poor Nolan. He occasionally availed of the permission the great man had given him to write to him. Long, high-worded, stilted letters the poor boy wrote and rewrote and copied. But never a line did he have in reply from the gay deceiver. The other boys in the garrison sneered at him because he sacrificed in his unrequited affection for a politician the time which the devoted to Magnahalia, sledge, and high-low jack, bourbon, euchre, and poker were still unknown. But one day Nolan had his revenge. This time Burr came down the river, not as an attorney seeking a place for his office, but as a distinguished conqueror. He had defeated I know not how many district attorneys. He had dined at I know not how many public dinners. He had been heralded in I know not how many weekly arguses. And it was rumored that he had an army behind him and an empire before him. It was a great day, his arrival, to poor Nolan. Burr had not been at the fort an hour before he sent for him. That evening, he asked Nolan to take him out in his skiff, to show him a canebrake or cottonwood tree, as he said, really to seduce him. And by the time the sail was over, Nolan was enlisted body and soul. From that time, though he did not yet know it, he lived as a man without a country. What Burr meant to do, I know no more than you, dear reader. It is none of our business just now. Only when the grand catastrophe came, and Jefferson and the House of Virginia of that day undertook to break on the wheel all the possible clearances of the then House of York by the great treason trial at Richmond, some of the lesser fry in that distant Mississippi Valley, which was farther from us than Puget Sound is today, introduced the like novelty on their provincial stage, and, to while away the monotony of the summer at Fort Adams, got up, for spectacles, a string of court-martials on the officers there. One and another of the colonels and majors were tried, and, to fill out the list, little Nolan, against whom heaven knows there was evidence enough that he was sick of the service, had been willing to be false to it, and would have obeyed any order to march any whither with any one who would follow him, had the order only been signed by command of his executive, A. Burr. The courts dragged on. The big flies escaped. Rightly, for all I know, Nolan was proved guilty enough, as I say, yet you and I would never have heard of him, reader, but that, when the president of the court asked him at the close whether he wished to say anything to show that he had always been faithful to the United States, he cried out, in a fit of frenzy, "Damn the United States! I wish I may never hear of the United States again." I suppose he did not know how the words shocked old Colonel Morgan, who was holding the court. Half the officers who sat in it had served through the Revolution, and their lives, not to say their necks, had been risked for the very idea which he so cavalierly cursed in his madness. He, on his part, had grown up in the West of those days, in the midst of Spanish plot, Orleans plot, and all the rest. He had been educated on a plantation where the finest company was a Spanish officer or a French merchant from Orleans. His education, such as it was, had been perfected in commercial expeditions to Veracruz, and I think he told me his father once hired an Englishman to be a private tutor for a winter on the plantation. He had spent half his youth with an older brother, hunting horses in Texas, and, in a word, to him, United States was scarcely a reality. Yet, he had been fed by United States for all the years since he had been in the army. He had sworn on his faith as a Christian to be true to United States, which gave him the uniform he wore and the sword by his side. Nay, my poor Nolan, it was only because United States had picked you out first as one of her own confidential men of honor that A. Burr cared for you a straw more than for the flatboat men who sailed his ark for him. I do not excuse Nolan. I only explain to the reader why he damned his country and wished he might never hear her name again. He never did hear her name, but once again. From that moment, September 23rd, 1807, until the day he died, May 11th, 1863, he never heard her name again. For that half century and more, he was a man without a country. Old Morgan, as I said, was terribly shocked. If Nolan had compared George Washington to Benedict Arnold, or had cried, "God save King George," Morgan would not have felt worse. He called the court into his private room and returned in 15 minutes with a face like a sheet, to say, "Prisoner, hear the sentence of the court. The court decides, subject to the approval of the President, that you never hear the name of the United States again." Nolan laughed, but nobody else laughed. Old Morgan was too solemn, and the whole room was hushed dead as night for a minute. Then Nolan lost his swagger in a moment. Then Morgan added, "Mr. Marshal, take the prisoner to Orleans in an armed boat and deliver him to the naval commander there." The marshal gave his orders, and the prisoner was taken out of court. "Mr. Marshal," continued old Morgan, "see that no one mentions the United States to the prisoner. Mr. Marshal, make my respects to Lieutenant Mitchell at Orleans and request him to order that no one shall mention the United States to the prisoner while he is on board ship. You will receive your written orders from the officer on duty here this evening. The court is adjourned without day." I have always supposed that Colonel Morgan himself took the proceedings of the court to Washington City and explained them to Mr. Jefferson. Certain it is that the President approved them. Certain, that is, if I may believe the men who say they have seen his signature. Before the Nautilus got round from New Orleans to the northern Atlantic coast with the prisoner on board, the sentence had been approved, and he was a man without a country. The plan then adopted was substantially the same, which was necessarily followed ever after. Perhaps it was suggested by the necessity of sending him by water from Fort Adams and Orleans. The Secretary of the Navy. It must have been the first Crowninshield, though he is a man I do not remember. was requested to put Nolan on board a government vessel bound on a long cruise, and to direct that he should not only so far confined there as to make it certain that he never saw or heard of the country. We had few long cruises then, and the Navy was very much out of favor. And as almost all of this story is traditional, as I have explained, I do not know certainly what his first cruise was. But the commander to whom he was entrusted, perhaps it was Tingey or Shaw, though I think it was one of the younger men. We are all old enough now, regulated the etiquette and the precautions of the affair, and according to his scheme they were carried out, I suppose, till Nolan died. When I was second officer of the Intrepid some 30 years after, I saw the original paper of instruction. I have been sorry ever since that I did not copy the whole of it. It ran, however, much in this way. Washington, with a date which must have been late in 1807. Sir, you will receive from Lieutenant Neal the person of Phillip Nolan, late a lieutenant in the United States Army. This person, on his trial by court-martial, expressed with an oath the wish that he might never hear of the United States again. The court sentenced him to have his wish fulfilled. For the present, the execution of the order is instructed by the president of this department. You will take the prisoner on board your ship and keep him there with such precautions as shall prevent his escape. You will provide him with such quarters, rations, and clothing as would be proper for an officer of his late rank, if he were a passenger on your vessel on the business of his government. The gentlemen on board will make any arrangements agreeable to themselves regarding his society. He is to be exposed to no indignity of any kind, nor is he ever unnecessarily to be reminded that he is a prisoner. But under no circumstance is he ever to hear of his country or to see any information regarding it. And you will especially caution all the officers under your command to take care that in the various indulgences which may be granted, this rule in which his punishment is involved shall not be broken. It is the intention of the government that he shall never again see the country which he has disowned. Before the end of your cruise, you will receive orders which will give effect to this intention. Respectfully yours, W. Scotthard, for the Secretary of the Navy. If I had only preserved the whole of this paper, there would be no break in the beginning of my sketch of this story. For Captain Shaw, if it was he, handed it to his successor in the charge, and he to his. And I suppose the commander of the Levant has it today as his authority for keeping this man in his mild custody. The rule adopted on board the ships on which I have met the man without a country was, I think, transmitted from the beginning. No mess liked to have him permanently, because his presence cut off all talk of home or of the prospect of returning, of politics or letters of peace or of war. Cut off more than half the talk men liked to have at sea. But it was always thought too hard that he should never meet the rest of us, except to touch hats, and we finally sank into our own system, into one system. He was not permitted to talk with the men unless an officer was by. With officers, he had unrestrained intercourse, as far as they and he chose. But he grew shy, though he had favorites. I was one. Then the captain always asked him to dinner on Monday. Every mess in succession took up the invitation in its turn, according to the size of the ship. You had him at your mess more or less often at dinner, His breakfast he ate in his own stateroom. He always had a stateroom, which was where a sentinel or somebody on the watch could see the door. And whatever else he ate or drank, he ate or drank alone. Sometimes, when the Marines or sailors had any special jollification, they were permitted to invite Plain Buttons, as they called him. Then Nolan was sent with some officer, and the men were forbidden to speak of home while he was there. I believe the theory was that the sight of his punishment did them good. They called him Plain Buttons, because while he always chose to wear a regulation army uniform, he was not permitted to wear the army buttons, for the reason that it bore either the initials or the insignia of the country he had disowned. I remember, soon after I joined the Navy, I was on shore with some of the older officers from our ship and from the Brandywine, which we had met at Alexandria. We had leave to make a party and go up to Cairo and the pyramids. As we jogged along, you went on donkeys then. Some of the gentlemen, we boys called them dons, but the phrase was long since changed, fell to talking about Nolan, and someone told the system which was adopted from the first about his books and other readings, as he was almost never permitted to go on shore, even though the vessel lay in port for months. His time, at the best, hung heavy, and everybody was permitted to lend him books, if they were not published in America, and made no allusion to it. These were common enough in the old days, when people in other hemispheres talked of the United States as little as we do of Paraguay. He had almost all the foreign papers that came into the ship, sooner or later, only somebody must go over them first and cut out any advertisement or stray paragraph that alluded to America. This was a little cruel sometimes, when the back of what was cut out might be an innocent as Hesiod, right in the midst of one of Napoleon's battles or one of Canning's speeches. Poor Nolan would find a great hole, because on the back of the page of that paper there had been an advertisement of a packet for New York, or a scrap from the president's message. I say this was the first time I ever heard of this plan, which afterwards I had enough and more than enough to do with. I remember it because poor Phillips, who was of the party, as soon as the allusion to reading was made, told a story of something which happened at the Cape of Good Hope on Nolan's first voyage, and it is the only thing I ever knew of that voyage. They had touched at the Cape, and had done the civil thing with the English admiral and the fleet, and then, leaving for a long cruise up the Indian Ocean, Phillips had borrowed a lot of English books from an officer, which, in those days, as indeed in these, was quite a windfall. Among them, as the devil would order, was the Lay of the Last Minstrel, which they had all of them heard of, but which most of them had never seen. I think it could not have been published long. Well, nobody thought there could be any risk of anything national in that, though Phillips swore old Shaw had cut out The Tempest from Shakespeare before he let Nolan have it, because he said the Bermudas ought to be ours, and, by Jove, should be one day. So Nolan was permitted to join the circle one afternoon when a lot of them sat on deck, smoking and reading aloud. People do not do such things so often now, but when I was young, we got rid of a great deal of time so. Well, so it happened that in his turn, Nolan took the book and read to the others, and he read very well, as I know. Nobody in the circle knew a line of the poem, only it was all magic and border chivalry, and was 10,000 years ago. Poor Nolan read steadily through the 5th canto, stopped a minute and drank something, and then began without a thought of what was coming. Breaths, breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself has said, It seems impossible to us that anybody ever heard this for the first time, but all these fellows did then, and poor Nolan himself went on still unconsciously or mechanically. This is my own, my native land. Then they all saw something was to pay. But he expected to get through, I suppose, turned a little pale, but plunged on. Whose heart hath ne'er within him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned, from wandering on a foreign strand? If such there breathe, so mark him well. By this time the men were all beside them. By this time the men were all beside themselves, wishing there was any way to make him turn over 2 pages. But he had not quite presence of mind for that. He gagged a little, colored crimson, and staggered on. For him no minstrel raptures swell. High though his titles, proud his name, boundless his wealth as wish can claim. Despite these titles, power, and pelf, the wretched concentered all in self. And here the poor fellow choked, could not go on, but started up, swung the book into the sea, vanished into his stateroom, and by Jove, said Phillips, we did not see him for 2 months again. And I had to make up some beggary story to the English surgeon why I did not return his Walter Scott to him. That story shows about the time when Nolan's braggadocio must have broken down. At first, they said, he took a very high tone, considered his imprisonment a mere farce, affected to enjoy the voyage and all that. But Philip said that after he came out of his stateroom, he never was the same man again. He never read aloud again, unless it was the Bible or Shakespeare or something else he was sure of. But it was not that merely. He never entered in with the other young men exactly as a companion again. He was always shy afterwards. When I knew him, very seldom spoke, unless he was spoken to, except to a very few friends. He lighted up occasionally. I remember late in his life hearing him fairly eloquent on something which had been suggested to him by one of Fletcher's sermons, but generally he had the nervous, tired look of a heart-wounded man. When Captain Shaw was coming home, if, as I say, it was Shaw, rather to the surprise of everybody, they made one of the Windward Islands and lay off and on for nearly a week. The boys said the officers were sick of salt junk and meant to have turtle soup before they came home. But after several days, the Warren came to the same rendezvous. They exchanged signals. She sent to Phillips and these homeward bound men letters and papers, and told them she was outward bound, perhaps to the Mediterranean, and took poor Nolan and his traps on the boat back to try his second cruise. He looked very blank when he was told to get ready to join her. He had known enough of the signs of the sky to know that till that moment he was going home. But this was a distinct evidence of something he had not thought of, perhaps. That there was no going home for him, even to a prison. And this was the first of some 20 such transfers which brought him sooner or later onto half our best vessels, but which kept him all his life, at least some 100 miles from the country he had hoped he might never hear of again. It may have been on that second cruise. It was once he was up the Mediterranean that Miss Graff, the celebrated southern beauty of those days, danced with him. They had been lying a long time in the Bay of Naples, and the officers were very intimate in the English fleet, and there had been great festivities, and our men thought they must give a great ball on board the ship. How they ever did on board the Warren, I am sure I do not know. Perhaps it was not the Warren, or perhaps ladies did not take up so much room as they do now. They wanted to use Nolan's stateroom for something, and they hated to do it without asking him to the ball. So the captain said they might ask him if they would be responsible that he did not talk to the wrong people, who would give him intelligence. So the dance went on, the finest party that had ever been known, I dare say, for I never heard of a man-o'-war ball that was not. For ladies, they had the family of the American consul, one or two travelers who had adventured so far, and a nice bevy of English girls and matrons, perhaps Lady Hamilton herself. Well, different officers relieved each other in standing and talking with Nolan in a friendly way, so as to be sure that nobody else spoke to him. The dance went on with spirit, and after a while, even the fellows who took up this honorary guard of Nolan ceased to fear any contretemps. Only when some English lady, Lady Hamilton, as I said, perhaps, called for a set of American dancers, an odd thing happened. Everybody then danced contra dances. The black band, nothing loath, conferred as to what American dances were and started off with Virginia Reel, which they followed with Money Musk, which in its turn in those days should have been followed by the Old 13. But just as Dick, the leader, tapped for his fiddlers to begin and bent forward, about to say, in true state, the Old 13, gentlemen and ladies, as he said, Virginia Reel, if you please. Money Musk, if you please. The captain's boys tapped him on the shoulder, whispered to him, and he did not announce the name of the dance. He merely bowed, began on the air, and they all fell into. The officers teaching the English girls the figure, but not telling them why it had no name. But that is not the story I started to tell. As the dancing went on, Nolan and our fellows all got at ease, as I said, so much so that it seemed quite natural for him to bow and to that splendid Mrs. Graff and say, I hope you have not forgotten me, Miss Rutledge. Shall I have the honor of dancing? He did it so quickly that Sherbrick, who was by him, could not hinder him. She laughed and said, I am not Miss Rutledge any longer, Mr. Nolan, but I will dance all the same. Just nodded to Sherbrick, as if to say he must leave Mr. Nolan to her, and led him off to the place where the dance was forming. Nolan thought he had got his chance. He had known her at Philadelphia, and at other places, had met her, and this was a godsend. You could not talk in contra dances, as you do in cotillons, or even in the pauses of waltzing. But there were chances for tongues and sounds as well as for eyes and blushes. He began with her travels in Europe and Versailles and the French. And then, when they had worked down and had the long talking time at the bottom of the set, he said boldly, a little pale, she said, as she told me the story years after, And what do you hear from home, Miss Graff? And that splendid creature looked through him. Jove! How she must have looked through him. Home! Mr. Nolan! I thought you were the man who never wanted to hear of home again. And she walked directly up to the deck to her husband and left poor Nolan alone, as he always was. He did not dance again. I cannot give any history of him in order. No, nobody can now. And indeed, I am not trying to. These are the traditions which I sort out, as I believe them, from the myths which have been told about this man for 40 years. The lies that have been told about him are legion. The fellows used to say he was the Iron Mask. And poor George Pons went on to his grave in the belief that this was the author of Junus, who was being punished for his celebrated libel on Thomas Jefferson. Pons was not very strong in the historical line. A happier story than either of these I have told is of the war. that came along soon after. I have heard this affair told in 3 or 4 ways, and, indeed, it may have happened more than once. But which ship it was on, I cannot tell. However, in one, at least, of the great frigate duels with the English, in which the navy was really baptized, it happened that a round shot from the enemy entered one of our ports square, and took right down the officer of the gun himself, and almost every man of the gun's crew. Now you may say that you choose about courage, but that is not a nice thing to see. But as the men who were not killed picked themselves up, and the surgeon's people were carrying off the bodies, there appeared Nolan in his shirt sleeves, with the rammer in his hand, and just as if he had been the officer, he told them off with authority. Who should go to the cockpit with the wounded men, who should stay with him, perfectly cheery, and with that way which makes men feel sure all is right and is going to be right. And he finished loading the gun with his own hands, aimed it, and bade the men fire, and there he stayed, captain of that gun, keeping those fellows in spirits till the enemy struck. Sitting on the carriage while the gun was cooling, though he was exposed all the time, showing them easier ways to handle heavy shot, making the raw hands laugh at their own blunders. And when the gun cooled again, getting it loaded and fired twice as often as any other gun on the ship. The captain walked forward by way of encouraging the men, and Nolan touched his hat and said, "I am showing them how we do this in the artillery, sir." And this is a part of the story where all legends agree that the Commodore said, "I see you do, and I thank you, sir, and I shall never forget this day, sir, and you never shall, sir." And after the whole thing was over, and he had the Englishman's sword in the midst of the state and ceremony of the quarterdeck, he said, "Where is Mr. Nolan? Ask Mr. Nolan to come here." And when Nolan came, the captain said, "Mr. Nolan, we are very grateful to you today. You are one of us today. You will be named in the dispatches." And then the old man took off his own sword of ceremony and gave it to Nolan, and made him put it on. The man told me this who saw it. Nolan cried like a baby, and well he might. He had not worn a sword since that infernal day at Fort Adams, but always afterwards, on occasions of ceremony, he wore that quaint old French sword of the Commodore's. And I think that's where we'll stop for the first part of Little Blue Book number 277, The Man Without a Country, written by Edward Everett Hale. And join me in the next one. Thank you.